Anyway, we're here to talk about, is cloud the utopia it used to be? If you remember, like in the early days, because I remember being around during the early days, the inception of the cloud, Azure coming out, Microsoft coming out to our businesses, gives us all briefings on it and free training and all sorts. And it just wasn't ready. It wasn't mature.
No, I agree with that.
Pricing was really expensive. But we have moved on, and the cloud is now a thing, right? We know that because even my nan's got stuff in the cloud on her iPhone. She knows about it, right? So everyone knows what the cloud is now, whereas before people kind of new to the concept of the cloud. But we've moved on a long way. So, but is it the utopia? Is it the place where everyone should be all the time?
I think it depends, doesn't it? I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve, I think, is the truth. And I think you've got to define what the cloud is, because I think lots of people are confused.
I know. Still.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I think lots of people, so in our technical world, people will say the cloud. If someone said the cloud to me, I immediately start thinking of the four big hyperscalers, right? You know what I mean? You start thinking of Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, things like that. That's the cloud to me.
Yeah.
But of course, if I asked my mum what the cloud was, she'd say it was iCloud, right? And so the definition of what is cloud is a little bit different, I think, for everybody. So in my mind, the cloud is actually anything that's connected to the internet. I mean, ultimately, everything that we have, even if we've got got a little rack of servers that are in our cupboard in our office, we're still connected to that internet. It still can be a
micro private cloud, isn't it?
Exactly that. Well, that's the key word, isn't it? So we've got this concept of a public cloud, which I think the hyperscale, I consider to be the hyperscale, is your private cloud, which is effectively your own data center that you've got control and manageability over, probably to a bigger degree than you get in the hyperscalers. You've got physical security that you can achieve inside your private cloud, which you can't obviously get. Well, you can. I mean, obviously, the deal is in the hyperscalers that even Microsoft can't see your data, and all that kind of stuff. So there are some guarantees made, but I think there's a difference between private cloud, public cloud. So the cloud, does it cover everything? Is it the utopia? Well, I guess if it's covering private cloud and public cloud, it sort of can do anything, right? So I think the conversation is: are we talking about moving to the public cloud? When we say the cloud, do we mean the public cloud? And all of the benefits of doing it around pricing, and apparently it's cheaper, and apparently it's easier, and it's easier to manage, and we can spin stuff up. So
is it cheaper?
No. Well, okay. So
is it cheaper?
It depends, doesn't it? If you wanted to go and lift a load of your old server estate, so if you wanted to lift a load of old servers and you did pure infrastructure as a service, and this is this as a service concept, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Software as a service, and these all have different meanings. So infrastructure as a service is me lifting my old server estate, all my old Windows servers and my Linux boxes, and lifting them up as they are, moving them over into Azure or AWS, and then turning them on and spinning them up, and me managing the operating system, the patching, the hardware resources underneath it that are required to keep that running. That is not a particularly cheap exercise.
No. On the one hand, you've got mitigate the cost of running that physically yourself. But the big challenge, I think, is understanding what those costs are going to look like over time. It's actually calculating what the reality of that is, just letting it go and letting it run and seeing what it costs.
But that's the first thing you should do, right? When you're thinking about should I be migrating to the cloud, all the big providers give you a cost calculator to kind of see where you're going. But for a lot of business, it's the move, isn't it, from capex to opex, or opex to capex, or
just understanding that cost creep over time.
So I remember for me, when we did a cost analysis in the early days, it just wasn't cost effective, and it was down to our preferential licensing through the government licensing scheme. And for us, it just wasn't cost effective at the time. We had just invested, I think, probably 2.5K, maybe 250, around that for a new SAN, something like that. I think we spent at the time, and our licensing was dirt cheap because it was government licensing scheme, so it was really, really cheap. And Microsoft came in and they were like, well, you could move this, and we were like, I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, I mean, when I worked it out, I sat down with my boss and did the analysis, and it just cost effective on licensing. Didn't make sense.
No.
Microsoft then changed their licensing.
Yeah, I was going to say, they definitely made it more attractive. I mean, there's things like there's something called the Azure High Reduce benefit, for example, where you can say if you've bought Windows Data Center, then you can use those licenses to spin up virtual machines in Azure. So you can offset some of the cost if you've already got licensing. Doesn't apply. I mean, and there are similar processes in AWS, but it's not quite the same. But I think you're right. I think the point is you've got to look at what are you actually moving and you shifting it over. I think the cloud works well and it's more cost effective when you look at your server estate and you break it down. If I wanted to move my file server, me lifting my file server with my Windows operating system and running it in the cloud is probably going to be more expensive over time than it is to run it locally. But as you say, it might be preferable because I can OpEx it rather than having to invest in it all up front in a CapEx model. So if I know that I can just want to pay for it little bit by little bit, then it might be a better way of doing it than me buying a load of hardware to start with. But the approach is to look at what is it you are delivering. What is the service that you're delivering on that server? If you're delivering a file service, then go and take a file service out of Azure or out of AWS and deliver files as a service. And that's where we get into this platform as a service thing rather than infrastructure as a service.
It is that case of understanding your workloads, understanding what the cost implications of those workloads are, if it's local, if it's in a public cloud environment. And that's what it comes down to. If you can't accurately calculate your costs over time, then you're probably going to run into a bit of difficulty.
Yeah, I think it's fair, yeah.
Because every time that machine's on, it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
Right?
But if you've got light workloads where you're not accessing them very often, or it's an archive or something like that, then it probably is more cost effective.
It is, you know, better than calling up, Iron Mountain or whoever to get your backups, right?
Yeah,
you can just get from the cloud. It's all stuck
there. Well, and you can scale, can't you? I mean, one of their big touting points is that you can, if suddenly you have a big demand, it's Black Friday, and you want to, you've got an e-commerce site, and it suddenly scales out massively. Then great, you can scale out for the 48 hours you need, and then shrink it back down again. So there are some big advantages, but to get that scalability, to get some of these features that you can have in the cloud, you sort of need a DevOps team involved. Do you know what I mean? You need someone who can program that functionality into it and start calling APIs to scale your nodes up and things like that. So it's not quite as simple as maybe it looked back in the day.
I don't know if it's still true, but
that's it.
It was a widely publicised skills gap.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's still true, but it seems that there's still a lot of hiring out there for those specific roles.
Definitely.
Definitely.
So how do you try avoiding? Say you've got the AWS, the Google, the Azure, and the open cloud providers, I guess, and mini cloud providers. How do you decide which one to go with, or should you be at one single one providing everything for you, or should you have a mix?
It's a good question, because people have got their little favourites, haven't they? If you're a Microsoft guy, you tend to sort of lean on Azure. So if you're a Linux guy, you tend to go AWS. If you went to university, you tend to go AWS because that's what they use in unis. The truth is, people have their preferences, but that's not a sensible decision, is it? Just going with what you like. Actually, you've got to look at pricing. You've got to understand, what is the requirement, what services they deliver. It tends to be security. I think that's the biggest decision. You've got to ask yourself, well, what is it about the platform that we need to deliver? How secure do we need it to be? What territories do we need it to run in? Because we've got data centers in these big hyperscalers all over the planet.
And there's governance, isn't there, around the way data can be stored?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you want to run stuff in the UK in our scenario, then great. We need to find a hyperscaler that has UK presences, to be able to store our data inside the UK. So there's decisions to be made based on that geographic requirement. But equally, there are decisions to be made around, if we're working with an MID organisation, then we want to make sure we've got certain levels of compliance against, certain things that, again, I know without giving the game away, one of the hyperscalers has got a lot more certifications and badges than another really big name. Do you know what I mean? So, and that tends to be why they're winning a lot of business in governments and in people like that. The UK passport office, for example, has moved a lot of their stuff to one of the big providers, because the other one can't guarantee the security. So there are these questions around security and around compliance and governance, and that makes a lot of decisions. But it's also an issue that if you put everything in, all your eggs in one basket, what happens when as unlikely as it is,
it does happen though.
But as unlikely as it is, suddenly Microsoft goes bust, which obviously isn't going to happen anytime soon. But suddenly, what happens in that scenario? And should you be spreading your
I think so. I think you have to look at the service you're trying to do, cost, do the proper analysis, sit down, calculate it, probably get someone in who's going to probably come in with a lot of knowledge around what can be best provided and easy use to manage. For your team.
And if you're developing modern apps, you're probably looking at it from the perspective of if my costs or the functionality becomes an issue, I need that app to function the same in Azure, in AWS, in GCP. There are real considerations around if I needed to move that out for any reason, how do I de-risk it? And then you're into hybrid or multi-cloud type scenarios.
So what would you not put in the cloud? Say out of all the infrastructures now, whether it's SQL or whether it's Exchange or whether it's and what wouldn't you put in there?
I'll tell you what I wouldn't put in there is data. I wouldn't put my back-end database in a hyperscaler and then my front-end client application in the office. Do you know what I mean? So that my back-end traffic's going across the internet to go. And I wouldn't do it. I'd put all of it up there. But the problem you have then is okay, let's say we've got this big accounting piece of software, for example, which uses a big SQL database. I've put my back-end database up there because I don't want to run an SQL database in the office, but all my applications and everything are running locally. So my only choice is to run the application locally and then connect this database across an internet connection. And that's really bad, really rubbish. It'll be slow. Everyone will moan. So actually, I want to put my front-end application up in the data center now as well. And suddenly I'm in this world where, how do my users use it? So now I need a remote desktop solution as well, so that people can remotely use my software up in the cloud. So I've gone from having this idea of stability and scalability because we can grow as much as we want, but it's costing me loads more now because I've got to have an RDS system and I've got to have some sort of remote platform my users can use. So there are things that aren't necessarily right, but the truth is we're moving. I'd consider that to be a sort of monolithic application, a proper old sort of like client server application. Whereas now everything's pretty much web-based, right? So the database up in the cloud, the client, the interaction, the application, the user interface is now driven generally through HTML and web pages. And that's suddenly easier to use, isn't it? That's why we've seen big growth in DevOps and.
I think the size of those transactions makes a difference, right? So
it does,
you take healthcare, you take things like large images, there's always going to be that element of keep some of that data local because you need fast access and you're dragging quite large amounts of information across the link. But in other scenarios, if you don't need that data for 10 years, but you need to archive it, push it out. Simple as that.
Yeah, great. The way I see it is if it's like crazy legacy, and those drivers are no longer supported, the likelihood of it working in the cloud is very unlikely. So it's the legacy apps that are way, way behind, that are really hard, maybe built in-house. Sometimes they don't sit in the cloud very well.
No.
And that for me is the biggest consideration, as I say, that most businesses should look at around that. Unless it's cloud ready. I like to say, like anything, right? It's cloud ready. Then you should probably have a proper investigation around that. Can it work in there and do some proper understanding around whether it can be cloud ready?
I think you're right. I think it's fair to say that most of the growth in the cloud is coming from that sort of modern app world, isn't it? Rather than the legacy app world. We've got to go back to the accounting term, you probably wouldn't put Sage in the cloud. But Xero obviously runs in the cloud, right? It's that exactly. But in the old traditional sort of like Sage front end and back end, database stuff. But look at the success of Xero, which is obviously running from a cloud environment, and everything's web based, and it's taking over because you can get to it from any device. You've got this flexibility and all this kind of stuff. So and equally, it's scalable, isn't it? As they grow, they just chuck more nodes in the cloud and grow up. So.
I think avoiding anything where you've got significantly re-platform, re-architect to try and get it to work versus, do I just build the next iteration for cloud with cloud in mind? And you'll always get some degree of trying to lift and shift some of those apps, and some will play better than others as we've found. But I think that's it. It's the ones that really not going to play well. They just don't suit that environment.
And that's a question for those developing those apps. The world is moving along, but I understand. I remember, hearing a story of a dentist, and he had some software on an old NT4 machine. For love nor money, he couldn't even move that to Windows 10. So
compatibility mode just wasn't working.
Nothing was working. So it was like, until they do something about the back end software, there's no way we can even think about it. No. So it's sometimes around the application. I think that's the key. And now we've got serverless apps and stuff like that, which is the new flavor of what everyone wants and everyone's moving to as well. You have to begin to move along with that in your app development, and that's more about developers. Technically, I look at AWS and the cloud as a space where developers get to play more than infrastructure guys.
I think it's definitely developers. It's a developer's Lego pen, isn't it? Really, it's everything's Lego blocks. You put stuff together and you build something, as opposed to lifting this thing you've already made and trying to shoehorn it into your Lego box. It just doesn't work.
I mean, if you're fortunate enough to be a startup in this day and age, I wouldn't invest in tin.
No, I think it's fair.
If I was doing a startup now, I wouldn't be investing in tin. I'll be investing in, we're going to cloud. It's a cloud first model, because then you're working around that.
It's only at scale that the tipping point probably goes in the favour of actually you could, because of the way those transactions work and the costs for ingress and egress, that actually we might be able to offset some of that. But you're right. I think you can get started quicker and cheaper, and ramp as you go. But you've just got to watch that cost creep over time.
I think it's also fair to say though that you're right. I mean, we basically have sat here and said that the cloud is brilliant for DevOps and for modern apps and for where we're going in the future and building new stuff. But the bulk of it isn't modern yet. Do you know what I mean? A lot of the applications that are still out there are still legacy based, still monolithic, they still require servers, they still want to run on Windows NT. Exactly that, an enterprise level. We've got some enormous, I mean, IBM are a great example, like absolutely enormous organization
still running
mainframes, right? I mean, you can't move their applications that they wrote 25 years ago into a cloud model. Our ATM and our cash machines are all still running 25-year-old bits of software. It's not going to move quickly.
I've literally been, if you're in London at any time and those wallboards break, you'll usually see an old, like 98 screen pop up.
Really?
What's the point? It's like, I know when you're running it. And a lot of I remember being at the bank and it was the same. When your till machines, you have a look at those, they're all like running Windows 98, or it's like, what is this? Like, absolutely. No wonder why it doesn't work. You know what I mean? Give me my money.
Banking closely followed by healthcare are they absolutely glacial in the adoption of newer technology.
And that's a security risk, right? At the end of the day, that's a security risk.
So what do those people do though? Do you know what I mean? Those people that have got those absolutely fundamental monolithic applications that they know they can't move to the cloud, they still have to keep investing in that stuff, or they have to now consider rewriting that software. But do you want to be the guy that writes the software to replace every ATM in the country and it not work? And like that's a big,
I wish I was.
task.
Big undertaking.
So I think it's fair to say there's still lots of people are talking about newer technologies and new brands, and I'm absolutely on board with that. And removing software from the platform, that's the point. So we talk about that infrastructure as a platform, moving the actual hardware, platform as a service, infrastructure service, platform as a service, where we're taking products, you know what I mean? And then we've got software as a service. We're detaching the application from anything. So it can run in any of the hyperscalers, it can run in any boxes we like. That's where we want to get to, but we're just not there yet with a lot of software.
Okay, that's enough for talking it down, but it does have its flexibility, right?
It does,
At the end of the day, like if you're in a situation where you are, say it's Black Friday or whatever, and you are a business and you are selling loads of products come Black Friday, it is the benefit that, you know, I can spin up 100 web servers where users can get in, rather than like in our day, when the first Black Friday, you try to go to a website and the website's crashing. We're getting less of that because of the cloud now, where the availability to buy is actually there. So it does benefit a lot of businesses and our ease of use as well as customers when we're trying to buy something or do anything on the web. So there is always that as well.
I suppose the flip side in flexibility terms is you are constrained by how that platform is architected. So there will be certain nuances that Amazon, that Azure have, and you can't overcome that because that's the architecture that they've built. You've got a lot of flexibility inside of the realms of possible within that platform, but there are some areas where some may have different features or functionality to others.
I think that's the other key thing, isn't it? Is in the cloud, you know, more so than ever now, we can spin up 100 servers to serve our e-commerce website. We can have, you know, whereas in the old days we'd have had to go out and bought 100 servers, or we'd have virtualized and had 100 virtual servers sitting on a load of tin. Whereas now we don't have to worry about tin, we don't have to worry about buying servers, we can scale up to 100 machines. And in our world, that doesn't mean that load balancing goes out the window. Do you know what I mean? We still need to load balance 100 servers, right? I mean, and I guess one of the issues that we have is that if you start to put servers in different hyperscalers, and they've all got their own kind of load balancer, you know, uniqueness, as you were saying, you know, and it's like unique, like the Microsoft load balancer, the Amazon load balancer, and they all behave slightly differently, and they've all got different configuration requirements. We end up in a world where we want one generic load balancer across all of our hyperscalers, right?
We're lucky enough we're there, right?
Exactly that. It's almost like we take that up like deliberately. So yeah, exactly that. So I think that, and that's where we exist now, right? You know, like we are not. What we're fortunate enough that we're in a position where we can support all of that old legacy stuff. We can also support all the modern apps and going forward, but the interaction with the load balancing, which is still so critical to anything that's scalable, doesn't have to change. So the customer can rewrite that monolithic application for a more modern app view, but the load balancing piece doesn't need to change, does it?
And I think that's part of the de-risking strategy, right? More companies are going hybrid because they know certain workloads, certain apps better local. They're going multi-cloud because they don't want to put all of their eggs in one hyperscaler basket. And I suppose the way to de-risk that is just to look at what you move when. You know, start with some of the perhaps less frequently used workloads, see how that works, or the modern apps where it's going to function well. Or if you're looking at replatforming one of your legacy applications, then move it, but understand that you're going to have to work on that architecture piece to make sure it behaves in the same way. And preferably use a load balancer that you can get the same application behavior locally and in any of the cloud platforms.
Yeah, agreed.
And the good thing about it is, majority of the time, as long as you get the configuration right, there is great security and great control over what you do.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a few bits and pieces that we build in, like the WAF and for us, that where we can bring added benefit in the cloud. We can bring a web application firewall because we can be. I wouldn't suggest that we are always the public-facing interface. I mean, we can be, but you might want to wrap other things in front of it. But obviously, we can offer layers of security. We can do the load balancing. It's the same for the dev guys. They're just writing their APIs against our load balancer. They don't care that that's running in GCP or that's running in Azure or anything like that. It's the same interaction. They're writing it once and it's done. You don't have to write for Azure and then write for AWS. And we've seen enough customers as well that have gone in one direction with a particular hyperscaler, and then pricing has hiked, and they want to move it, and they want to move it. Well, suddenly they've got to rewrite parts of their application. The big hyperscalers are banking on you, investing entirely into their world, so that it becomes a little bit difficult to shift around. And I think you see a bit of that.
You see a bit of that repatriation as well, whether we put it in the cloud, but the costs have crept up, and we're now looking at, do we move it to another cloud? Do we move it back to our own data center? And I think that's where having a more open approach to the way your application's designed is really beneficial, because you've got that flexibility to pull it out if it becomes a problem. The thing about load balancing with a load balancer like us in the cloud is around that cost piece as well, and understanding that the cost of that particular component is much easier to understand. You have to use the calculators in the public cloud platforms to work out the costs, and there are a certain amount of rules and a certain amount of ingress and egress traffic. It's all charged for versus an instance cost and a license cost.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question on behalf of the customer. I've decided, I've got some stuff, but the business wants me to put this in the cloud. They want apps up there. Can I take my bit of tin, decommission, and put it in the cloud at no extra cost, or does that cost me extra? From the load balancer perspective.
Oh, from the load balancer perspective, yeah. So we've got our freedom license basically. Yeah. So we do. So if you've already got a load balancer, then within reason, with options around the freedom license, which lets you then lift a license and go and move it and put it into another state, if that makes sense. So you could go and put it in AWS, or you could move it around. But you can go into the marketplace in all of our stuff. So go into the Microsoft Marketplace, AWS Marketplace, and you can pull down our appliance and spin it up. One of the points I was going to make actually was that when you're interacting with our stuff, if I were to build lots of services in Microsoft, in Azure, for example, right? So I wanted to host a couple of different websites, I'd probably have to go and buy a load balancer from Microsoft. So I take it out of their store for each of those applications that I want to deliver. Yeah. So even though I want to be able to load balance my application, which presents itself in 5 or 6 different ports and things like that, I'd have to have 5 or 6 load balancers and then pay ingress and egress and ingress charges on that. So I think another real benefit to having a single load balancer provided by a load balancing organization is that you can load balance as much as you like, right? And you're just going to pay once for that license, put it in a highly available pair if you want to, and then just pay for the licensing once and load balance whatever you want behind the scenes, and do it at layer 4 and do it at layer 7, which some of the hyperscalers will struggle with. So there's some real advantages to not just assuming that the Microsoft or the AWS load balancers are the go-to thing. But yeah, more directly in answer to your question, I think you get more functionality out of us by moving into the cloud. 2, if you've got a freedom license, then you can lift and shift.
Nice. I think that's a good point to end on. James,
yes.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always. Scott, it's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you for having us.
And is it a utopia? I don't know. I'm still.
Depends what you're doing. Depends what you're doing.
I would say it is if you're a startup, it's great, it's fantastic.
I think you're bang on.
If you're
if you're a bank,
if you're a bank, it's going to be hard.
Requires a bit of caution.
Yeah, a bit of caution. So yes and no.
Yeah, perfect.
Place to wrap on.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Cheers,
guys.
guys.